Minecraft 1.20.5 is out with some rather huge technical changes. My name is Sliced Lime, and in this video I'll be walking through all the data pack changes in pack versions up to 41. This version brings lots of new attributes, a massive change to items with lots of related command, loot table and predicate changes, and much more. So grab your popcorn, put up your feet and settle in, because this is going to be a long one. Let's start with those attributes. The most obvious one is the generic.scale attribute. This can be used to scale any living entity up or down between sizes 0.0625 up to 16 times the normal size. You can change this on mobs as well as on players using the attribute command. The second new attribute is generic.step-height, which controls how far up you can step without needing to jump. The default is 0.6 and the valid range is from 0 to 10. You can step up a wall if the total height of that wall is strictly less than your current step height value. Two other closely related attributes, player.block interaction range and player.entity interaction range. They both range between 0 and 64, but the block range defaults to 4.5 while the entity range defaults to 3. The range controls how far you can reach in interacting with blocks or entities respectively, and this goes for both attacks, punching a mob or mining a block, and for interactions, like opening a chest or riding a boat. The player.block break speed attribute has been added. Changing this value changes the speed of breaking blocks regardless of whether the player has the correct tool or not. Valid values range between 0 and 1024. Setting it to 0 makes a player completely unable to break blocks. Setting it to 1024 is nearly, but not quite enough to insta-break obsidian with a bare fist. This is different from giving effects like mining fatigue in that it doesn't affect the arm swing animation. The next added attribute is generic.gravity, which controls the gravity affecting an entity in meters per tick squared. Allowed values range between -1 and +1, with the default value being 0.08. Negative gravity does indeed make you fall upwards. The horse jump strength attribute is now called generic.jump strength and can be used for all living entities. This controls the base impulse of a jump before any other modifiers like jump boost or the reduction from standing on a honey block. Allowed values are between 0 and 32 with a default of 0.42. The generic.safe fall distance attribute controls the number of blocks you can fall without taking damage. The possible values are -1024 to +1024 with a default of 3. Negative values mean that at the start of a fall, you already have some bonus built-up fall damage, so for instance -1 means you'll take a heart of damage from even jumping up onto a block. And finally, the generic.fall damage multiplier attribute can be used to simply multiply all fall damage with a set amount. This ranges from 0 to 100 with a default value of 1. Item stack data formats have changed everywhere in the game, both in inventories and other places where items are referenced in data packs like icons of advancements. The format is now consistent and the same everywhere. The big change is that the NBT data found in the tag field has been structured into a new set of data components. This change has been made both to increase the performance of the game looking up item properties and to pave the way for future improvements to the game's support for custom content. The difference between the old tag data and the new components is that the component data is read and validated when an item is loaded, rather than later on when it is used. This both enables immediate error messages when some data is wrong, and increases performance for data that the game needs often, like armor trims. The ability to store custom data on items still remains. There's a new custom data component that can store any NBT data. Advanced tooltips now show the number of components of an item instead of showing that it has NBT data. All items are now represented with a namespaced ID, and where more than one are possible, a lowercase count. This includes the icon field of advancements, items in text components, and the result field in smelting recipes. The count field of an item can now be omitted, with the default value of 1 being used in that case. Air and count 0 are no longer used to represent empty item stacks. Instead, the item should just be omitted. In places where this is impossible, like in equipment lists, an empty object is used instead. One thing to note is that it is no longer possible to set an invalid count in order to get stacks of items over the max stack size for that item. The new components are stored in a new components field, which contains a mapping of component type to whatever data that component type holds. But note that components that are set to the default value are not stored. Default values for all items are now also generated by the game's data generator into the items.json file. Each item type has a template for which components that item should have. Component types can also be specified with an exclamation mark prefix mapping to an empty object, which causes that component to be removed from the item. Let's do a quick walkthrough of the available component types. We already talked about custom data. It stores an object of NBT, which the game itself never uses. The damage component stores a single non-negative integer value representing the damage to an item with durability and replaces the damage tag. The unbreakable component can be added to an item to make it not lose durability when used. It replaces the unbreakable tag and can contain a show-in tooltip boolean, which by default is true. Adding the unbreakable component to an item no longer makes it incompatible with the unbreaking enchantment. The repair cost component stores a single non-negative integer representing the additional XP cost required to process an item on an anvil, and replaces the old repair cost tag. The Enchantments component replaces the Enchantments tag, but has quite a different format. The main part is a levels field, which contains a mapping from namespaced enchantment ID to level. It can also have a show-in tooltip boolean, which defaults to true. The Stored Enchantments component replaces the Stored Enchantments tag and has exactly the same formats as the Enchantments component type. There's a new component type called Enchantment Glint Override that stores a single boolean, and which can be added to an item to override its enchantment glint, either forcing it to have it or forcing it not to have it. The Custom Name component type replaces the name tag inside the display tag and stores a text component in stringified JSON format. The Lure component type replaces the lure part of the display tag and stores a list of text components in stringified JSON format. One change here is that this list now has a maximum limit of 256 entries. The Adventure Mode properties of an item can be found in two new components called Can Break and Can Place On, which replace the Can Destroy and Can Place On tags, respectively. Both have the same format. Predicates, which is a list of block predicates representing the blocks the property applies to. These predicates can in turn have a blocks field, which is a block, a list of blocks, or a hashtag block tag ID. A predicate can also have a state field, which is a mapping of state names to the required value, as well as an NBT field, which is an NBT tag to match against the block entity data. The Adventure Mode components also have a show-in tooltip boolean, which defaults to true. Projectiles loaded into a crossbow are now stored in the Charged Projectiles component, which stores a list of projectile items loaded into the crossbow and replaces the Charged boolean tag and Charged Projectiles list tag. One change here is that the list is no longer restricted to 3 entries. Those items in turn can have another new component called Intangible Projectile. This component stores no data, but when it is present on a projectile, causes that projectile to become intangible when fired, which means it cannot be picked up in survival mode. Potion data is stored in a new Potion Contents component. This replaces all of Potion, Custom Potion Color, and Custom Potion Effects. This has an optional potion field for the type of potion. If this is set, all effects of that potion will be applied. Custom Color can change the color of the item's potion overlay and the effect particles. And Custom Effects is a list of effect instances which are all added to the effects of the potion. Suspicious Stew effects have their own component too, which replaces the effects tag and keeps the same format as before. Attribute modifiers now have their own component. The modifiers themselves are stored under the Modifiers field as a list, where each entry has a type field, which is the Attribute ID, previously known as Attribute Name. Each entry also has a slot, which can now be one of the equipment slots, but also any for any slot, hand for modifiers that work when holding an item in either hand, and armor for modifiers that work when wearing the item as armor. UUID name and amount still work mostly the same, although the fields are now lowercase. Operation has changed into an ID instead of a numeric value. The possible options are add value, which replaces 0, add multiplied base, which replaces 1, and add multiplied total, which replaces 2. The attribute modifiers component also has a show-in tooltip boolean, which defaults to true. Let's move on to container contents. Bundle contents holds all items stored inside a bundle and replaces the items tag. If this component is removed, items can't be added to a bundle at all. The format is a list of the item stacks contained. The container component holds the contents of shulker boxes in item form and is then copied to the shulker box block when the box is placed. This data used to be stored in the block entity tag as items. The format is a list of slots, each of which is a slot integer between 0 and 255, and an item field containing the item stack in that slot. For containers that have a loot table, that data is now stored in the container loot component, which replaces the loot table and loot table seed tags inside the block entity tag. The container loot component has two fields: loot table, which is the ID of the loot table to evaluate, and seed, which is an optional 64-bit integer field containing the fixed seed to use for the loot table. If the seed is 0 or not specified, a random seed will be rolled when the container is opened. The lock component contains the key data for a locked container-like block. It is a single string, which causes the container to only be openable with an item with a matching name. The block entity data component replaces the block entity tag and still contains unstructured NBT data, which is copied to a block entity when the block is placed. Data that has specific support in a different component is removed from this tag. The data must also contain an ID field with the block entity type. The block state component replaces the block state tag and is a map of property names to their values and can be used to force the state of a block when it is placed. Decorated pot sherds are stored in the new pot decorations component, which replaces the sherds tag inside block entity tag and keeps the same format, which is a list of sherd item IDs. The profile component replaces the skull owner tag of player heads. This can be specified as only a name or UUID, which causes that player's skin and ID to be looked up. Otherwise, full properties can also be specified. The sound a player head converts a note block into is stored as a sound event ID in the note block sound component, which replaces the note block sound tag inside block entity tag. Entity tag has been replaced with the entity data component, which stores unstructured NBT data that is applied to an entity when it is spawned by an item such as a spawn egg or an armor stand. The data must contain the ID of the entity type. The bucket entity data component contains the data about an entity stored in a bucket, like a tadpole or fish. This replaces the direct copies of some of the entity fields like no AI, silent, no gravity, glowing, and so on. All the replaced fields are now supported inside the bucket entity data component instead. Bees inside a bee nest or hive are now stored in the bees component, which is a list of bee entries and replaces the bees tag inside block entity tag. Each bee entry has an entity data object which contains the tags to merge into the bee when it leaves the block. This must contain an ID field. Each bee entry also has a ticks in hive integer and a min ticks in hive integer. The color of dyed items is stored in the dyed color component, which replaces the color tag inside the display tag. The format is an RGB field containing the integer representation of the color, and they show in tooltip boolean. Armor trim data is stored in the trim component, which contains a pattern, a material, and a show in tooltip flag, which replaces the trim tag. The custom model data tag has been replaced by a custom model data component, which contains a single integer that identifies the custom model. Banner patterns are now stored in the banner patterns component, which replaces the patterns tag inside block entity tag. This is a list of patterns where each pattern has a pattern field containing the namespaced ID of the pattern. These namespaced IDs replace the shorthand pattern strings used before according to the table on screen. The color field contains the dye name of the color, which is converted from the color integer used before, translations on screen again. The base banner color used when a banner is applied to a shield is stored in the base color component, which is a single color name. This replaces the base tag from the block entity tag and is also translated from a color number. The numeric ID of a filled map is now stored in the map ID component as a single integer. Any decorations on the map are stored as the map decorations component, replacing the decorations tag. This component is a map from a unique string name to decoration data. Each decoration data contains a type, which is now a name instead of a numeric ID as shown here. In addition, the X and Z world coordinates are also stored, as well as a rotation float, which is the rotation of the icon in degrees clockwise, with 0 degrees denoting up as north. This replaces the rot tag. The map color tag inside the display tag has been replaced with the map color component, which contains a single value containing the integer representation of the RGB color. The target of a lodestone compass is now stored as the lodestone tracker component, which replaces the lodestone pos, lodestone dimension, and lodestone tracked tags. The data is an optional target field containing a block position stored as a pos list and a dimension field with the dimension ID. Omitting this field makes the compass a targetless one that will spin. The lodestone tracker component also has an optional tracked boolean, which defaults to true. The writable book contents component contains the contents of a book and quill and replaces the pages and filtered pages tags. This is now represented as a single pages field, which is a list of page data. Each page can be specified as either a plain text string of the page contents or as an object with raw and filtered fields containing the raw text and filtered alternative. Written book contents is an expanded version of this for signed written books. The pages list for written books works the same way, except the contents are full text components instead of just strings. In addition, the written book contents also has title and author string fields, a generation field from 0 to 3 denoting how copied the book is, and a resolved boolean denoting if the text components have already been resolved, that is, scoreboard entries have been looked up, selectors inserted, and so on. When the resolved's value is false, the components will be resolved the next time a player opens the book. The explosions of a firework star are stored as the firework explosion component, which now replaces the type, colors, fade colors, trail, and flicker tag inside the explosion tag. Each explosion has a shape field, which is a named shape converted from the numeric format type used before as seen here. The colors field is a list of RGB values in integer form, which will be randomly selected from, and fade colors is a list of the same format for the colors to fade to. Has trail is a boolean for whether the explosion has a trail, and has twinkle is a boolean for whether the explosion twinkles, which has been renamed from the flicker tag. A fireworks rocket has all its explosions in the fireworks component. This has an explosions list with entries of the same format as the firework explosion component, as well as a flight duration byte, which denotes the number of gunpowder used to craft the rocket. The instrument of a goat horn is stored in the instrument component that replaces the instrument tag and keeps the same format, a namespaced instrument ID. The hide additional tooltip component has been added, replacing the 6th bit of the hide flags tag. When present, it prevents the item's additional tooltip from being displayed. The hide tooltip component can be added to an item to make it not have a tooltip at all. It is an empty object. The recipes component holds the list of recipes unlocked by using a knowledge book and keeps the format of the recipes tag, a list of namespaced IDs of recipes. Finally, the debug stick state components replaces the debug property tag and stores the currently selected properties per each block type. Those were all the components replacing the old data. You still with me? Wow, thank you for that. You're a true datapack mastermind for sure. We're not quite done, but please do drop a like on the video already. This is quite the effort, and each like does help out in the algorithm. Some properties that were previously bound only to the item type can now be changed per item stack with new components. Let's start with the food component. This can be added onto an item to make it edible, with a nutrition value giving the number of food points the item restores when eaten. Saturation is the exact amount added to the player's saturation level when the food is eaten. Eat seconds is the time it takes to eat the item, and can always eat is a boolean which can be set to true for items that can be eaten even when the player is full. Effects is a list of effects that get applied when the item is eaten. Every entry in this list has a probability field which determines how likely the effect is to get applied between 0 and 1, with 1 being the default. Entries also have an effect field which describes the effect instance and has the same format as the effects in, for instance, suspicious stews. Any items which are food by their item types now have an implicit default food component describing that food. Note that the food component can only make things edible if the item doesn't already have another use functionality. Let's move on to the max stack size component. This is an integer and describes the maximum stack size of the item and ranges from 1 to 99. Max damage similarly describes the durability value of the item when it is entirely undamaged. The value is a positive integer value. Items that do not have a max damage component either as a stack component or by default from the item type cannot be damaged. Items are not allowed to have both a max stack size component and a max damage component at the same time. That is to say, you cannot have an item that is both stackable and damageable. Fire resistant is an empty component that, when present, makes the item fire resistant, just like netherite items. The rarity component controls the rarity display in the item's name. This is one of common, which is the default and gives a white name. Uncommon gives a yellow name, or aqua if the item is also enchanted. Rare gives an aqua name, which switches to light purple when the item is also enchanted. And epic always gives a light purple name. The tool component controls how an item can be used for mining blocks. This component has a rules list which determines how the tool interacts with various blocks. Each rule has a blocks field, which is a block ID, a list of block IDs, or a block tag, which matches which blocks the rule applies for. Speed is an optional field that determines the tool's speed at mining those blocks, and correct for drops controls whether the tool is considered the right tool for the block in loot tables. If none of the rules match, the default mining speed float value controls the speed of the tool, or 1 if that isn't set. The damage per block field is a non-negative integer which controls how many points of durability are deducted for every broken block. Vanilla built-in tools have an implicit default tool component for the vanilla behavior of the tool. There's a new component for the item name. This is a text component and it separates the name of the item from the custom name, which can be changed by a player. For instance, the custom name of an item can be changed as an anvil, while the item name is the name of the item when it has no custom name. Another new item component is Ominous Bottle Amplifier, which contains a single number representing the amplifier. A number of these components have an alternative simple form. Generally, this means that for these components, if you do not want to specify the Show in Tooltip flag, you can skip the containing object and inline the main field of the component. Item syntax in commands has been updated to give direct support for components. This means you can use square brackets, similar to how you'd write a block state, to specify component content. This now gives you auto-completion on the component type, but not on the data for that component. Specifying any data in curly braces is now invalid. There are new slot arguments used by the item command. There's a new slot called contents for entities that contain only a single item, like item entities, item frames, and item display entities. You can now use player.cursor to access the item held in the player's cursor for players in survival or adventure mode, and player.crafting.0, 1, 2, and 3 to access the crafting slots in the player's inventory screen. There's a new command that uses these ranges as well. Execute if or unless items. This can be used to check for items in either entity or block inventories. The slots used in this command also support new slot ranges. For slots that have subfields like container.a number, you can use container.asterisk to check all those slots. When using a slot range like this, the check succeeds if any of the slots match the given item predicate. The item predicate syntax for commands like clear and execute if items has been significantly expanded. The syntax for this is a type followed by optional square brackets with a comma-separated list of tests. The type is an item ID, a hash prefixed item tag ID, or an asterisk representing any item. The test in square brackets can be an exact component match, a component name followed by equals and then an exact match for the full component data. Another option here is also to have only a component name alone. That means just checking that the component exists at all. The final basic form of a check is an item predicate check. That is written as a predicate type followed by a tilde and then the predicate data. Those predicates are the same type of predicates that you would otherwise write in loot table conditions or advancements, but instead of writing them in JSON format, they're now written as SNBT, which, if you don't recognize the name, is the format of components and tags in commands. These basic forms can also be negated by prefixing them with an exclamation mark, and combined together in OR form using a pipe symbol, so you can express things like a component being entirely missing or having a certain range of values. As a special case, the count value of an item stack is also exposed as count. You can match that exactly as a component with an integer value, or a predicate called count, which is formatted as an integer min-max range. In more command news, loot tables, item modifiers, and predicates in execute if predicate can now be written in line. Any place that previously accepted the ID of one of those resources can now be written directly in the command. Much like item predicates, these have the same format as they do in JSON files, but are instead written as SNBT. Item predicates have also changed. The tag field has been removed, and the items field now supports either an item ID, a list of item IDs, or a hashtagged item tag ID. There's also a new optional components field, which matches the exact data of components. Each component specified must match exactly the given data, but the item may also have additional components. Item predicates have been split into sub-predicates. Some fields from the main predicate object have been moved into items in a new map called Predicates, which has a similar format to components on an item stack. That goes for enchantments, stored enchantments, potions, and custom data, which are all now sub-predicates, with potions also being renamed to potion content, and also supports a potion, a list of potions, or a potion tag. The NBT predicate field has been renamed to custom data and now matches the custom data component. It has also been expanded to accept both fully structured data as well as the previous format of SNBT data in stringified format. The durability field has been turned into a damage predicate. This predicate can now be used to test for either the damage of an item or its durability, that is, the maximum durability of the item minus its current damage. These sub-predicates all now require that a matching component exist on the item in order to pass. For instance, that means that a predicate checking for damage 0 will fail for items that do not even have durability. There are new item sub-predicates as well for container, bundle contents, attribute modifiers, firework explosion, fireworks, trim, writable book content, and the written book content component. In general, fields in these predicates that match the name of the field in the component match that field's value. Generally, the type is the same as the type of the field in the component, but fields in the sub-predicate are optional, and not specifying it means that there are no requirements on matching that field. There are some exceptions to this. Integer and float fields are matched by min-max ranges. Any registry types, that is, most namespaced IDs, are replaced with a matcher that can be an ID, a list of IDs, or a hashtagged tag name. And any lists are replaced by a new collection matcher type. These collection matchers can have a size field that is used to match the collection size, a min-max range. You can also specify a contains field, which is a list of predicates for the elements. For instance, for a list of items, the contains field would be a list of item predicates. All of these conditions must match for the collection to match, but there's no requirement for every item in the collection to be matched. A single element in the component collection can also match multiple predicates. You can also specify a count field, which is a list of matchers on element counts. Each such matcher has a test field, which is a predicate on the item in the list, and a count field, which is a min-max range describing how many such elements should exist for the test to pass. The result item for recipes of type crafting shaped, crafting shapeless, stone cutting, and smithing transform now accept data component definitions under the components field. In addition, the results field of smelting, blasting, smoking, and campfire cooking recipe types have been changed from a string describing an item to a full item definition, including an ID field with the item ID and a components field that accepts data components. Note that this item does not accept a count field. The resulting item count is always 1. And Stonecutter recipes now support multiple items of the same result type, but with different component sets. For loot tables, the setNBT and copyNBT functions have been renamed to setCustomData and copyCustomData. The setCustomData function has also been modified, so the tag field now accepts both the existing format of SNBT in string form and full data in inlined format. There's a new function called setComponents, which adds or replaces a set of components on an item. It has two fields. Conditions is a list of conditions to check before applying the function. And components is a map of component type to component data, much like for command input, and here too you can use a prefixed exclamation point to remove an existing component. Another new function is copy components, which copies components from a specified source to the loot item, and which is now used in the vanilla data pack instead of the copy name and copy NBT functions. It also has a list of conditions to check before applying the copy, and an include and an exclude list. Both lists are optional. If include is omitted, the default is to include all components, and if exclude is omitted, the default is to exclude nothing. Only components that are included and not excluded will be copied. Finally, it has a source field specifying the source to copy the components from, which at this point only has one possible value: block entity. Set firework explosion can be used to modify the firework explosion component on the item. This has a conditions field for conditions that decide whether to apply the function. Then it has optional fields for the fields of the component: shape, colors, fade colors, trail, and twinkle. The fields that are present will cause those fields on the component to be replaced by the given values. The set fireworks function can similarly be used to set the fireworks component values. It also has a list of conditions and then an optional field to set the flight duration. Then it also has an optional field explosions, which contains both the list of explosions in a field called value and the mode field, which determines how this manipulation is done. That field can be one of replace all, which replaces the set of explosions on the rocket. Replace section replaces only a section of the explosions in the list. This is accompanied by two optional arguments, offset and size, determining the section to replace. If offset is omitted, 0 is used. If size is omitted, the size of the list in the explosions field is used. Mode can also be insert, which inserts explosions into the list. This can be accompanied by an offset field, which is the index to insert explosions before in the list. If no offset is given, 0 is used, inserting the explosions first in the list. And finally, mode can be append, which appends explosions to the end of the list. Let's move on to set book cover. This function lets you set the cover details of a written book. This also has a conditions field and optional fields for title, author, and generation. The values of the fields that are present will be used to replace the existing details. There are two more functions for manipulating books: set writable book pages and set written book pages. Both have the same fields. The difference between them are the same as the difference between the two components on the item stack. In addition to the regular conditions, fields on these functions are pages, which is a list of page data, and mode. This mode works exactly like the mode setting on the set fireworks function. There's a new function called set ominous bottle amplifier. This sets the ominous bottle amplifier component based on a number provider in the amplifier field. As with other functions, you can also specify a conditions list. Modify contents is a way to modify the items inside a container by applying an item modifier to each element. It has the standard conditions field like other loot functions. You specify which component the target is in the component field, exactly like for the set contents function. And the modifier field is either a modifier or a list of modifiers to apply to every item inside the container. The set item function sets the item type of the item stack without changing the count or the components. It also has the normal conditions list and a single other field called item with the new item type ID. Set custom model data sets a custom model data component on the item. It also has conditions and then a value field, which is an integer number provider for the value to set. Toggle tooltips. This function can set the show in tooltip flag of various item components. The format is a toggles map, which maps component names to whether the tooltip flag for that component should be turned on or off. Finally, the filtered function applies a sub-function only to the items that match a certain item predicate. Other than conditions, it also has an item filter field specifying an item predicate to use for matching, and a modifier field specifying the functions to apply to the matching items. A few other changes to functions. You can no longer nest lists to represent sequence functions inside other sequence functions, which is equivalent of a flat list anyway. The loot table entry, which returns all items from a provided nested loot table, now has the field value instead of name. And this field can be the namespace ID of the loot table, but can now also be a full loot table specified in line. The set lore function no longer has a replace field. Instead, it has a mode field and accompanying fields like those added for set fireworks and the functions for setting book pages. The set contents loot function has been changed with the new added component field, which is mandatory and describes which type of component to set. Possible values are container, bundle contents, and charged projectiles. The existing contents of the target component will be replaced.
and bundle contents and charged projectiles will ignore any empty item stacks. The unused type field has also been removed.
The set attributes function has been updated and now supports all the new slot arguments from the attribute modifier's data component. The operation values have also been renamed to match the operators in the component and the command syntax.
It also now has a replace field to determine whether to replace or add to the default attribute modifiers for the item type.
The set name loot function now has an optional target field. It specifies one of custom name or item name to allow setting the new item name component. If omitted, the default is to set the custom name component just like before. There's a new number provider for storage. That provider is able to access numeric values in command storage directly into loot tables. The provider has a storage field specifying the namespace ID of the storage to access, and a path field giving the path to the value. If that value doesn't exist or isn't a number, the provider will give a value of 0.
In addition to the loot tables for the added mobs in this version, there's another new loot table,
gameplay/panda sneeze, which means the loot for a sneezing panda is no longer hard-coded. And there's a new loot table type, Minecraft:"equipment. This is used for a new loot table in the experimental update 1.21 pack, equipment/trial chamber. And if you have the update 1.21 pack on, there's a new loot table, shearing/bogged. Block and fluid predicates have been updated, the tag field has been removed, and block and fluid have been renamed to blocks and fluids. The type of these fields is now a single block or fluid, a list of blocks or fluids, or a hashtag prefixed block or fluid tag. Entity predicates have been changed so the type field follows the same pattern: a single entity type, a list of entity types, or a hashtagged entity type tag.
The equipment entity subpredicate now has a body field that can be used to match equipment in the body slot.
The type-specific type field is now a namespaced ID, and the any type-specific subpredicate has been removed. Entity predicates can now use a new slots subpredicate. This can use either a single slot or a slot range to check for item contents. The subpredicate consists of a mapping from slot or slot range to item predicate, and here too, if a slot range is used, any matching item will cause the predicate to match. There's a new entity subpredicate, Raider. It has two fields. Has raid, which matches whether the raider is in an active raid or not, and is captain, which matches whether the raider is a captain. The variant subpredicates for cat, frog, and painting now accept tags and lists of variants instead of just a single element. And there's a new variant subpredicate for wolf variants. And location predicates have been updated, with biome and structure renamed to biomes and structures, and now supporting a single entry, list of entries, or hashtagged tag ID. In entity and data news, item components with non-default values are now stored on block entities when those blocks are placed. Those components can then be restored when the block is broken by using a copy components function in the loot table for the block, which is done for some of the block entity blocks by default. The serialized form of these components is the same as on items, a component field which is a map from namespaced component ID to component data. Some components that had prior handling like custom name might not be present in the components field since they are already loaded into the block entity itself. Note that removed component types are not supported in block entities. The Scute item has been renamed to Turtle Scute.
Default values of potion effect data no longer get stored, which means the amplifier or duration being 0, the ambient flag being false, or the show particles flag being true now means that value will be missing from the effect data. Potion effect amplifiers have changed to now always interpret values as positive. This removes the ability to access all the unsupported negative amplifiers, which have instead been replaced by new attributes.
Tipped arrows now use the stored item for potion contents instead of storing it directly. And area effect clouds store a tag matching the potion contents component in a field called potion contents. The beehive block entity format has been updated to store bees in the same way the bees component does, and the flower pass field is now a snake case lowercase format. Banners now store their patterns in the same format as the banner patterns component in a field called patterns. The block entity data for monster spawners and trial spawners has a new optional field in the spawn potentials called equipment, which if present specifies a loot table to use for equipment on the mobs as they spawn. Equipment is an object with both a loot table field specifying the loot table to use, and a slot drop chances field, which is an optional map of equipment slot ID to drop chance. You can also instead specify a single value, which will cause that drop chance to be used for all equipment slots.
Armor on non-humanoid entities has changed. Horse, llama, and wolf armor items are now stored as body armor item, which works like the hand items and armor items fields, and also comes with a body armor drop chance. All entities which have hand items and armor items fields now also have the new body armor item and body armor drop chance fields. This also means that the horse.armor slot argument to commands referencing item slots no longer exists, and instead armor.body can be used. All block positions are now stored as arrays of 3 integers. Previously, some block positions were stored as arrays and some as objects with X, Y, and Z fields. Some fields have been renamed in entities and block entities, including in bees, beehives, end crystals, leash-related fields, patrolling-related fields, end gateways, and wandering traders. The skull owner and extra type fields of skull block entities have been replaced with a profile field, which is now the same format as the profile item component. And the anger time and angry at fields of mobs can now be set when summoning the mob. And the new vault block has some new data fields. Config is a set of data about its drops, with loot table specifying the loot table which gets rolled when the vault is unlocked. The activation range and deactivation range fields specify how close players need to get for the block to activate. Key item specifies the item stack needed to unlock the vault, where both count and NBT has to match. And override loot table to display is an optional second loot table. This is used to roll the complete set of items to display inside the vault instead of showing random samples of the unlocked loot table. Those are all the fields of the config data, but the vault also has more data in a shared data field, which contains a connected particles range field, which determines how far away players need to be before the particles start showing. Display item stores the item currently being displayed by the block. The UUIDs of all players who have opened the vault are stored in the rewarded players list, and the UUIDs of all players who have not opened the vault but are in range of it are stored in connected players.
There's a new entity in this version as well, the ominous item spawner. This entity is experimental and can only be used when the update 121 pack is on. It has 2 special fields, an item field which is a standard item stack format and represents both the item shown in the spinning graphic and the item spawned. The spawning of items has some special properties. If the item is a projectile item, it will be spawned as if shot from a dispenser facing downward. Other items are simply spawned as item entities. The entity also has a spawn item after ticks field, which is the amount of ticks before the item is spawned as a 64-bit integer. Before that, the entity shows an animation, and 36 ticks before the item is spawned, the preparation sound plays. Unfortunately, that field is currently broken when used from commands. What you're seeing in this video is a modded patch for that error. The new wolf variants in this version are data-driven. Adding a wolf variant is done by adding a file under the wolf variant registry folder. This is not reloadable data at the moment, so changing this data will require a world save and reload. The files for wolf variants have 3 fields for the texture of the wolf: wild texture for the default texture, tame texture for the texture once tamed, and angry texture for the texture of a wolf attacking something. The last field in the format is the biomes field, which defines which biomes the variant can spawn in. This is either a single biome ID, a list of biome IDs, or a hash-prefixed biome tag. Of course, in order for this to work, the defined textures must also exist, so you may have to add a resource pack for the custom wolf. The next format available is for banner patterns. This can be found under the banner pattern registry folder. Each asset here is pretty simple. It has a translation key pointing out how the pattern is described, and an asset ID, which is a namespaced ID. This ID is used to derive the locations of the pattern textures for both banners and shields. As with the wolves, you'll probably need to add a resource pack with the banner textures. Another thing to note is that if you want them to show up in the loom without requiring a pattern item, you'll also want to add your custom banner patterns to the no item required banner pattern tag. In command news, macro command for missions have been fixed, including for cache instances of a macro,
The maximum length of a command in a function is now 2 million characters, and overrunning the limit in a macro instantiation now gives an error. The maximum depth for placing a jigsaw with the place command has now been adjusted to the new limit of 20, and 2 bugs with the tick command have been fixed. Chunk loading tickets no longer expire when the game is frozen with tick freeze, and the AI of mobs now updates consistently, even the tick after the game having been frozen. The player and the mixer channel are now optional for the play sound command, defaulting to @s and the master channel respectively. The weather command now always sets the global weather, which means it also works in custom dimensions. This version also introduces the new transfer command. This command exposes the new transfer packet added in this version. The syntax is transfer followed by a hostname and port, and then optionally by the players to transfer. If the target players are not specified, @s is used instead. If you also leave out the port, the default Minecraft server port is used. The transfer command requires admin level permissions and therefore by default cannot be used from command blocks or datapack functions. Let's talk about particles. The representation of particles in commands has been changed. Instead of some particles having extra parameters, this is now handled by passing the parameter configuration in curly braces. The same representation is now used for particles stored in area effect clouds, and this data matches how particles were previously specified in world generation files. Some changes have also been made to these particle representations. The block particle type field value has been renamed to block state, and that field now also accepts a block ID, which represents the default block state of that block. Item particles have similarly had their value field renamed to item, and that field now also accepts an item ID, which represents that item with all default components. The count field is now ignored. The entity effect particle options value field is now called color, and now accepts a list of floats representing the RGBA color values as well as the previous representation of a packed integer. And the dust color transition particle fields from color and to color have been renamed to snake case. This version also adds 8 new particle types: Vault Connection, Infested, Item Cobweb, Small Gust, Raid Omen, Trial Omen, Trial Spawner Detection Ominous, and Ominous Spawning. In advancements, there are new triggers. Crafter Recipe Crafted triggers when a crafter crafts a recipe and triggers for all players closer than 17 blocks on all axes. It has a player predicate matching the player the advancement is triggering for, a recipe ID which matches the ID of the recipe being crafted, and ingredients, which is a list of item predicates matching the ingredients being used up in the craft. There's also a fall after explosion trigger, which triggers when a player starts moving downwards after having been knocked upwards by an explosion or windburst. That has a player predicate matching the player. Start position is a location predicate matching the position the player was at when the explosion hit. And distance is a distance predicate matching how far the player has reached by the time they turn downwards. And cause is an entity predicate matching the entity causing the explosion. Default block use triggers when a player interacts with a block using its default interaction. And any block use triggers when a player interacts with a block in any way, including both using items on blocks or interacting with them without an item. And finally, an advancement fix. The taken damage criteria is now correctly calculated for damage from falling blocks when the player has a helmet equipped. There are some other small bits in this version as well. In damage news, Llama Spit is now its own damage type called Spit, and wind charges also have their own wind charge damage type if you have the Update 1.21 experiment on. This pack version also has a new game rule for the size of the spawn chunks, measured in chunks from the center, called Spawn Chunk Radius. This game rule ranges from 0 to 32 with a default value of 2. Enchantment news in this version. Projectile weapon enchantments like Infinity, Multi-Shot, and Piercing now work regardless of which weapon they are on, if placed on those weapons using data manipulation or by changing the Enchantable Crossbow and Enchantable Bow tags. The ID of the enchantment Sweeping Edge has changed from Minecraft:"Sweeping to Minecraft:"Sweeping Edge. And there are new tags.
Let's start with entity type tags and ignores poison and regen for entities that cannot be affected by poison and regeneration effects, by default all undead mobs. Illager Friends is all entities that Illagers consider to be allies unless they are placed on different teams. Inverted Healing and Harm is all entities for which healing hurts and harming heals. Not Scary for Pufferfish is all entities that don't make Pufferfish puff. Sensitive to Bane of Arthropods, sensitive to Smite, and sensitive to Impaling are, well, those are left as an exercise for the viewer. Wither Friends are all entities that the Wither will not attack and that cannot harm the Wither. There are also new convenience collection tags Aquatic, Arthropod, and Illager. These don't do anything in and of themselves, but they are used in other tags. Redirectable Projectiles has been added, which controls which projectiles can be redirected by attacks or other projectiles. The Update 1.21 pack also has a new Deflects Projectiles tag, which replaces the old Deflects Arrows and Deflects Tridents tags. There's a new entity type tag called No Anger from Wind Charge. And 2 new tags related to the new effects, Immune to Oozing and Immune to Infested. There are also new item tags. Collection tags here too: foot armor, leg armor, chest armor, head armor, and skulls. These are used by new enchantability tags under the Enchantable folder. The complete list is on screen now. There's a new item tag for dyeable items, which by default contains all the leather armor items including leather horse armor and wolf armor. Lots of food related new tags. Axolotl tempt items has been renamed to Axolotl food, and lots of other something food tags have been added for all mobs that eat something. Some other new something tempt item tags have been added though, for the cases where mobs might be tempted by other items than those they eat, like for horses and llamas. There's also a meat tag, which is a collection tag. Its only use is that it is referenced from the wolf food tag. And finally, there's a parrot poisonous food tag. The Tools item collection tag has been removed, and the Breaks Decorated Pots tag now directly has its former contents. There are now new block tags called Incorrect for Tier Tool, determining the items that can be mined with a certain tier of tool. In vanilla, these tags are filled with the other tier tags, so for instance the Incorrect for Iron Tool tag is made up of the Needs Diamond Tool tag. There's a block tag for Armadillo Spawnable On, with the blocks armadillos can spawn on. Does Not Block Hoppers controls full blocks, which hoppers will still search for items inside. By default, that contains only bee nests and beehives. And with the Update 1.21 pack on, blocks wind charge explosions for blocks that the wind charge cannot hit through. By default, bedrock and barrier blocks. There's a new damage type tag, Player Attacks, for the attacks considered player attacks, which by default only contains the player attack damage type. So by default, only player attacks are considered player attacks. Yes. And there's a new enchantment tag in this version called Tooltip Order, which determines the order in which enchantments show up in tooltips. In custom world generation news, int and float providers are no longer wrapped in an extra value field. Instead, the provider data is now specified at the same level as the type. Note that the format changes for particles apply to world generation files as well. And there's a new option for terrain adaptation for structures called Encapsulate, which increases density not just around the outside of the structure, but also around the individual pieces of that structure. Pack loading changes. You can no longer disable data packs that are tied to feature flags. And with that, we have reached the end of the very long list of datapack related changes in 1.20.5. My name is Sly Slime, thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.